in Barcelona.
Well, it's actually in
Paris. And then
That's right.
Direct to.
But that's 6 hours from Paris. Yeah, it was so comfortable. Yeah, it was great. We had a really good time. Yeah, so we were there for, we were gone in total for 2 weeks. So we stopped over in Paris.
No, this one is
My water.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a fantastic time. Very not by any means, but incredible. So like I actually and light and airy and the rainbow, trees,
which we might do afterwards.
Yeah.
What a mind, you know?
Did you go downstairs into the basement? So did you see the string wall?
Yeah. I mean, all that stuff.
I know. So yeah, we had a really good time. And I just got back yesterday, so I haven't been working good. Yeah, but exactly. I'm now in the 6 months to finish.
Yeah.
My nope, I'm done with that.
I think I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to introduce
whatever I have
to you today. And this is going to be partially a talk, partially a workshop entitled Co-Creating Radical Design Principles for a World in Flux. It should be quite exciting. I'm very excited. So Lesley-Ann Noel is an assistant professor in the Department of Design Studies at North Carolina State University. She has a BA in Industrial Design from the Universidade Federal do Paraná in Curitiba, Brazil. She has a master's in Business Administration from the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. She earned her PhD in Design from North Carolina State University in 2018. She is co-chair of the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group and of the Design Research Society. Before joining North Carolina State University, she was Associate Director of Design Thinking for Social Impact at Tulane University, and she was a lecturer at Stanford University and the University of the West Indies. She is one of the editors of the Black Experience in Design, an anthology featuring stories of 70 Black designers. So will you all join me in welcoming Lesley-Ann, please?
Introduction. Maybe it's not all of that. Or it's all of that and more, like everybody else. So I had to come up with a title for this presentation, and I just said, okay, let's put some words together. But I mean, even the title includes some of the things that drive the work that I do. You know, I'm very passionate about co-creation. Radical is a word that I use way too much. And flux was not a word that I would have used before spring, but I certainly do focus on crisis and even things like, how we talk about crisis and who's in crisis and stuff like that. And so yes, thank you for this invitation to come and, as we say in Trinidad, bump my gum a little bit, but I'll also have you doing stuff. So, everything must change. This is the way I feel about everything. You know, I half jokingly tell my students that I'm the person who wants to just burn down everything and start over, right? And sometimes I have to kind of pull myself back and say, okay, you can't burn everything down. But, in Designs for the Pluriverse, Arturo Escobar he refers to the existence of a critical design studies field and construction. So I suppose I consider myself part of that movement. And I think that there are, as many of you would know, there are a growing number of designers, students, researchers who are just agitating for change, fast, radical, dramatic change. And maybe every generation feels like this, and this is just our moment to feel that it's our time for change, right? Question everything is maybe the way I feel about the world, and it's the kind of mindset that I'm trying to foster in the classes that I teach. You know, when nothing is sacred, we can challenge everything. We can do the work that we do as designers, but it is up to us to question as we do the work, you know, are the processes working? What is a new way? What is a different way of doing this kind of work? And this has got me into trouble in some of the places that I've worked. But I do question everything. We talked about positionality earlier, so I do always like to talk about my positionality. So as some of you may know, I grew up in the Caribbean. Not even I grew up in the Caribbean, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. Grew up sounds like I left and have no more connections. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. I studied in Latin America. I lived in Brazil for 6.5 years. I've worked in the Caribbean, Latin America, East Africa, and now I live in North America. So that gives me a kind of strange view of the world from many different perspectives. And for decades, I, like many other people, have been questioning everything about the way I was taught to do design, the way, the way I've been expected to teach design as well. You know, I was telling someone over lunch that I moved from a non-tenure track position to a now tenure track position, and so now there are a lot more expectations from me about what I will teach and the way I will teach, whereas I had a lot more freedom when I was non-tenured on the non-tenure track, if I could kind of continue with my question everything. But even though I'm now on the tenure track, I still question everything, right? So this questioning and my impatience with the world and the structures around us is, I suppose, evident in all of the work that I do. You know, so I'm probably not going to give you some of the theory that Ramya and Erling will give you, but you'll see the impatience leads to a different kind of work. You know, I'm just, ready to burn it down and do things, you know, that I reflect on and then make changes. Maybe to give you a little bit of the structure, though, this isn't gonna be a talk. So you're not here for a 90-minute talk, right? Phew. You're here, I'm just kind of giving you a presentation that's going to set things up for you to do some stuff, right? So the presentation is going to help you understand maybe where some of my action comes from, right? And then we're going to do stuff together, and then we'll talk again after that, right? So, I guest lectured in a design class this week and also had some conversations with some of my own students, and they asked me about which design principles should guide the work that they do. And I turned it around and asked them what principles they thought should be important. You know, and first then some people put their hands up and they said, well, cost, of course, is the first thing that I was surprised, but it was the first thing that came up. Cost, profit, speed of production, efficiency of materials, and all of this stuff is stuff that, yes, maybe I had to think about in the 90s when I studied. But I also saw some students who were a little bit more timid in saying what else they wanted, but then they talked about crises of today, racial unrest, the loss of reproductive rights in the United States, crises related to water and food access, you know, and they didn't want to be driven by the other principles that they consider to be driven by modernity and industrialization and patriarchal Western capitalism. So, let's see. In Designs for the Pluriverse, Escobar prompts us to consider that design can be reoriented from its functional, rationalistic, and industrial traditions towards a type of rationality and set of practices attuned to the relational dimension of life. And so here you see, some students who are rejecting these kinds of models, and they're more interested, more and more people I think are talking about other design principles, other principles that could be driving their work. And Escobar is asking us to consider moving away from where design seems to have started. And so this seems to be the way some of my students would like to see design develop. And it is actually like the direction that I've been challenging myself to go. So as we continued our discussion, students were asking questions like, could a design principle be, for example, community? Could design be driven by love, by slowness, right, among other non-capitalist principles? And these are actually questions that I've been considering for quite some time, and so I was excited to hear the students talk about this. Rather, I will bring the question in through a question, but I don't actually always tell the students about the work that I'm doing. So actually, none of my students have ever seen the critical alphabet in the classroom. But I'll bring the questions in a different way. So, for me, I think it's a little bit hopeful that different values and value systems could lead to radically different design outcomes. And I'm hoping that that we will in fact go in those kinds of directions. All right. So as a little bit of an aside, radical is a word that I like to use a lot. And as some of you might know, I do like definitions. So, every now and again I'll use a word and then I'll have to try to figure out, okay, what does that word really mean? So radical, according to some dictionary online, I could find out which one, is advocating or based on thorough or complete political or social change, representing or supporting an extreme or progressive section of a political party. So, some people are afraid of the word radical, whereas other people are excited about it. And so it is a word that is a little bit contentious, where if I talk about radical, some people are like, oh, we have to step away from that. But other people who are interested in change are looking for radical change. So I want to give you all a little bit of an example of the way that maybe different questions and different worldviews might be able to affect design. If we're not just focusing on these typical questions about these principles of cost and efficiency and stuff like that, maybe we'll get to different outcomes. So this is an example. The example I'm going to give you is from a collaboration that I worked on, a class that I co-taught that took place in both Trinidad and California at the same time. I was actually in California, and then a colleague of mine, Michael Lepoy, he was in Trinidad working. And the students in Trinidad did a lot of research and interviewing and use these anthropology skills that we borrow. And the subjects for this intervention were the students in California, right? So we kind of flipped the direction that people traditionally expect. And the students in Trinidad noted, they remarked at the end of the research phase, those people in California seem rather lonely. Which the students in California actually said it really disturbed them to hear that kind of diagnosis about themselves, and they kind of rejected that these outsiders could just come and diagnose their problem, and then after they're like, oh, but that happens all the time, actually, right? So, anyways, we thought about that the people in California seem to be very lonely from the perspective of a worldview of the people in Trinidad. And then it actually made us think, how interesting that Facebook the most, the biggest social network platform is housed in California, right? The place where people are lonely, right? So what would Facebook look like if it actually was designed in Trinidad or in Brazil, in places where people have stronger connections to community and maybe understand socializing better than people in California, right? So how would social practices and the community focus of these places drive the design decisions if the platform were created in a different place, right? So this is a way that you could start to see that, different worldviews and different questions could lead to completely different outcomes. But is it practical? I've had this kind of question asked many times, when...
I found this on the web.
Okay, thank you, sir. That's radical. Random. People ask me all the time, well, okay, are you really trying to do something serious or is this a thought experiment? Can we really do things that are not modern? And people have asked me questions like at the DRS 2022 in Bilbao, someone did ask me, well, what's the benefit of these critical perspectives? We really do need to focus on cost efficiency, technology, and materials, right? But yes, I do think that we can be driven by design principles that are not typically part of this so-called modern agenda, right? And we don't all have to be forced to operate within frames and schemas that don't match our values. Because as I said earlier, different values could lead to new questions and points of focus and outcomes, right? And people within other disciplines have moved away from their traditional agendas. And I'm going to provide 2 examples. So I am atheist, but liberation theology I think is pretty interesting, because in religion, liberation theology focuses explicitly on confronting the injustice done to the poor. And in this case, not just the economically disadvantaged, all of us are the poor that they're focusing on. They're talking about people who are exploited at work by capitalist systems, migrant workers like myself. I'm not a typical migrant worker, but also, exploited like other people who are migrant workers, And so liberation theology seeks to address the lives of the oppressed and to facilitate and support their own liberation by themselves, not by other people, through the Freirian concept of conscientious assault, supporting them to see what is keeping them back and mobilizing them to take action. And another example from another discipline, in the judicial system, restorative justice focuses on the victim's needs and offender responsibility for repairing harm, as opposed to criminal justice, which focuses on offenders getting what they deserve. So, restorative justice has a different kind of perspective. It's guided by different philosophies than the criminal justice system. It focuses on harms and needs and obligation to put right and engagement of stakeholders. And it uses empathy for all, dialogue, participation, and healing. And then restorative justice in education brings restorative justice principles into the education space, creating and focuses on creating just and equitable learning environments, nurturing healthy relationships, repairing harm and transforming conflict. And then if you are using a restorative justice approach in education, you are seeing that race matters, history matters, justice matters, and futures matter. So, I'm sharing this for us to see that actually we can think about design, research, and practice being driven by completely different principles that could radically change the way that we do the work that we do. And I'm sure that many of you, like me, are also hearing other people having these conversations. I've been getting a lot of requests for advice on bringing these types of philosophies into design. So people have asked me to write, and I'm not actually a writer. I mean, I write, but I write because I have to maintain my job. Right? Yeah. But people have been asked me to write about emancipatory design, equity-centered design, justice and service design, restorative design. So it's clear that there are a lot of people thinking about, can we create more ethical frameworks in design? And people have been doing this. All right. So some of you may know the work of Antoinette Carroll from the Creative Reaction Lab. So Antoinette developed the equity-centered community design process. That is a design process that embeds humility, healing, and collaboration into the design process. And like several people, she's actively rejected what we, I guess, call or know as human-centered design. And she's proposing an alternative. Let's see. So here you can see this is the process that her organization uses as they do their work. And I believe that this is downloadable. There is part of the work that you can buy and part of it that is available for download for free. Another example, Tanya Anaisi and the National Equity Project. They are in Northern California and had some affiliation with the D School, but then they were dissatisfied then with the hexagons and felt that they needed to add notice and reflect. And then actually last year, I think they took their dissatisfaction a little bit further and they said, you know what, we don't want any images that's even connected to the hexagons. And they created this flower that they said helps people to see the process as much more organic than the original hexagons. And then many of you, I suppose, would know the work of Sasha Costanza-Chuck and the Design Justice Network, who have created the Design Justice Principles, which is a series of 10 principles that you can sign on to, you can download. The last time I checked, there were like 2,000 and something people who had signed on to these principles. But this is a little bit of what I want, where hopefully we might get today, where we'll come up with some principles for design. And then maybe I have two more examples. Lesley-Ann McKercher, or K.A. McKercher, has the model of care. K.A. does civic design and community design in Australia. And again, is someone who is very principle-driven, and believes in the way that community work should be done, and is talking about it. And then the last example I have to share, the Design e Opressão Network in Brazil. They have dialogical and anti-dialogical reflection cards, which are meant to they're based on Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, and they're meant to help designers reflect on why and for whom we design for whom we design, and to provoke us to question design processes as anti-dialogic or reinforcing oppressions, or dialogic and promoting alliances with the oppressed in the struggle to overcome oppressive situations. And this work, this is available in a paper, a DRS paper, and the authors are Mazzaroto and Serpa. And it's interesting that, the anti-dialogical cards are maybe supposed to be, they're kind of represented as what is considered good design. So this Helvetica kind of text. And whereas the dialogical cards are represented then with possibly what could be considered more chaotic font choices and colors, and but some of that is our protest, right? So like, I come here in this jumpsuit so that you see me, right? I'm not going to come and dress up all in black because I want to fit in, right? As designers who are protesting, we want to stand out, right? So just like a quick way of, I'm going to refer a little bit to my own work, right? Which I know some people don't do, but I will. Because I want you to see that these are not just thought experiments. You know, I have been thinking about principles and guiding words and keywords. And I used to have the little posters up in my office to help me figure out, okay, what is the work that I want to do and the work that I don't do, okay? So my own keywords are related somewhat to my positionality as an Afro-Caribbean, global Southern, female identifying designer. And these words are related to power sharing and participation and emancipation, access, you know, and all of the work that I do then is related to this. And I check the work and see, well, is it aligned with the principles that I'm interested in? Now, I'm in academia, and I'm a little bit older than some of the people who are in the same position that I'm in, you know. So I'm an assistant professor, but I've been around the block a few times. So I can operate on this principle and say, well, okay, I am saying no to certain things. But I think it is important for us to create space to identify what are our values and what are our principles, and have those principles drive the way that we address work. And so that then, these principles show up in, for example, the positionality wheel that Rowan referred to, where I ask students every semester, we start off where people talk about their positionalities, and we immediately create a space where we can talk about, students will say, white students in particular will say to me at the end of the semester, I have never talked about race in a design class, right? But we start there. We talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about economics, we talk about language, you know, we start there. The designer's critical alphabet, which passed around the room, is another example of that, where I was working with a particular group of students and wanted to nudge them in other directions without actually telling them, you're only focusing on white men who are age 28, right? And so creating these cards then was a device for me to encourage a different kind of conversation. The Good Vibes alphabet, which is a little less known, but that has many Global South principles driving that alphabet. The Black Experience in Design, of which I'm one of the co-editors. But again, it is about access and storytelling, and so it's driven by these principles. And then I just published an article, New Futures for Design Education. And again, there you could see some of the work that, you could see how these principles come into everything. But it's not only thought experiments, you know, and I'm also doing this with funded research, you know, and I'm saying this particularly for maybe PhD students in the room, because, you know, in my PhD experience, one of the people who was on my advising team for a very short minute said to me, well, are you an activist or a researcher? And I was like, I can't be one or the other, you know, I have to be, you know, because of who I am, I have to be maybe both, right? And she felt that it wasn't possible, you know, that we had to be doing objective research, and, you know, and so I'm kind of sharing these examples so that if you are in the PhD process, you can see how you can bring in your principles and your, you know, into the work that you're doing. So at Tulane University, we did work about design and patient-centered outcomes, well, work that brought together design and patient-centered outcomes. And then a lot of the work, I do a lot of civic innovation work that is still driven by these kinds of principles of participation and power sharing and dialogue. I'm going to wrap it up, yes. In Puerto Rico, my colleague Maria de Mater O'Neill and we created a curriculum that was focused on Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and creating a space for students who were dealing with crisis at the time. And then the last example is, of course, the work that I do in the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group, which we have a book club, which is probably the most exciting thing that we do. There's a book club next week, Friday. But, again, this is about access and, really having different kinds of conversations across design. So, we need a manifesto, you need a manifesto, you need guiding, I'm not coming like this, you need guiding principles. But today's session is then about creating this manifesto, right? And we're going to organize you into some groups around the room where your little groups are going to have a principle to consider, and you are going to then create a sentence for our manifesto based on that design principle. I wonder if anyone can see the kind of subliminal message that is in this slide. Maybe some of you wouldn't do it. Anyone following the Brazilian election?
Yeah, of course. That's Lula. And
okay. Yeah. I don't know if...
It's like send all your post a picture of all your red books.
Yes. 13, if you look for the hashtag 13 libros vermelhos, 13 red books, you will see kind of subversive support of one of the candidates. So there are a lot. I'm not even asking you to read these now, but there will be some design principles floating around the room, and then we are going to assemble these principles into a manifesto. And if we go back, I'm going to go back to the design justice principles. Could use this as a kind of example. So your little team is going to take one of the design principles, and you're going to start off with we. You're going to put in some kind of action verb. You have to use the word design, and you have to use that principle that you've been assigned to, right? In a sentence, talking about the way you're going to work in the future, right? And I'll actually tell you what I used to have on my wall by my desk when I was a PhD student. My principle had something like, in the work that I do, I commit to sharing power with, because that was one of the principles that really drove everything that I did. I had to make sure that power was being shared in the process. So you're going to get a principle. You have to decide, what does this principle mean to you within your team, and then what does it mean to us as designers, and then you're going to create a sentence, and then we'll all come back together and share our manifesto. So I guess we will pause for a bit here. I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions or anything before we go into the group work. Don't run away during the group work. People have a way of doing that. So if anyone has any questions now, I guess I can take one or two. But I'm really excited to see what your group is going to propose as the design principle for your team. And then we have lots of material so that you can make your poster really kind of pretty, nice, designerly, right? So maybe I should hand back the floor. Yes. How do we break people up? If we could we have 17 design principles. I think 17 groups might be too much. We could work in groups of about 4.
Okay, that works. I think we're basically in groups, so if the 4 of you, I'll just come around and put people together. Up there. You 4 come on together back there. You 4 here.
And then we gamify things, right? So you pick a principle.
I pick on behalf of Great. And then somebody wants to join their group.
Are you in a group at the back? Yeah. And
We will
Talia, if you're with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to come over here?
Where? Okay, yes. So you can pick it.
A lot of pressure.
These are the part with the...
Hi.
What's your name? There are supplies here. There is paper, there's tape, there are scissors and markers. So just come down. Maybe one person come and grab anything. Oh, you
So we need some pen.
Mainly you need a
Because we had the pens in.
So what size?
Every group has a principal now? All right, so I'm going to give you... Yes, you can do this. 2 o'clock, everybody Were you assigned to a group? Oh, okay, so you're Oh, I just wanted to make sure yours didn't have the same.
I know that it's used as more delightful and talk about how emergency persists.
No, you're going to order. Let me see if I can get back to the map. You will.
Yeah, so you will free how people free themselves.
You will
Finally realize.
where you were focus on rather than philosophy. So it could be a problem about what you want. That's just now you're going to see I don't separate. Yeah. It could be both. Right? Yeah. See what I'm aiming to do? No, but from feeling.
It's kind of interesting that it's like
Codependency.
You know what? Be about the process. What is it that you're designing to
And all of the ways, we will, so that if someone gives you a project later on that's we come back to this principle that you create and see where it doesn't align with our principle. Maybe that was unclear. Run around to all of the groups and tell them. There's a little bit of
There are some people.
Starts with design, it's oriented, and with justice card.
perfect.
Yeah, like rather than equality, if we took equity, so you've almost got to level, level up. But because equal redistribution would be, it's not restorative justice, we're not kind of recognising that certain people are already unequal. So I'm just thinking whether the word equity
over equality.
Yeah.
I also wonder, like, is it as a principle, having like justice as a principle,
Because
as like from the point of view of the designer, or having a practice that creates justice,
like
like justice in what way? Trying to reach justice, having justice in them in your practice. Am I trying to make it happen in everything I do, or am I being just when I do?
Yeah, and that brings back to the power. Like we now just saying designers decide.
Yeah. It's like we don't want that. We, and I wonder whether we can also break that apart. Because one of the principles around justice is also perhaps history is already being implicated in an unjust system. But maybe I'm being too meta here.
No, but that's good. But the thing is, what you're pointing at is maybe the designers won't be the new facilitators.
The other thought I have, aside from that definition, if I think about justice, it's about being fair. Everybody's got to something, feel that the institution is fair to them, whether it's
like solidarity where you're actively
object or fairness.
But I feel like with justice, there's already an unfairness, and you're trying to reach justice. You don't need justice when there is fairness. You know what I mean? It feels to me like more of a, well, maybe just people talking about harming or not. It's not about creating fairness.
Yeah, it's
finding that unfairness.
Yeah,
creating just active.
Is justice a sense of like redress? It's like is it to fix something like that was already quiet?
Well, this says it's systemic. Racial justice is a systemic thing, so it can't be like justice as a fix. You know what I mean? Like, you'd have to do something with some sort of systemic that addresses the systemic situation with design. That's how I feel. Oh, good point.
Sorry, excuse me, Lesley, how much time do we have for this activity?
Okay, we have 13 minutes.
So we're going to get writing.
Yes, 13 minutes to get the principles together.
Okay, so
So you
that's
take that.
yeah, and then
I think that secondary I just started. But I think it's we have to start with and use design. Start with it's almost like you start with you have to do the work. It's almost like I want so I don't know
You have 10 minutes left.
It's just for long.
When I use both, and then people say, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Why do they?" I'm not sure. But the principle can be about your design team's work, or it can be about the outcome that you're trying to foster through the initiatives. But it's just a guiding design principle. Kind of like, but that one, if you had come up with that one, that would have worked, but that exists, because that has elaboration in it. It's 9 minutes now to think about these sentences.
And then I was like, okay, one
that demand.
Your face looks like
By the beauty.
Maybe it's actually not we, but radical practice demands designers interrogate the system. Justices. But we could interrogate that. Yeah, contest that. So
we contest, we and demand that.
We're like one of our students, so it's like, I know you've asked me to do a talk about packaging.
oh, design justice demands.
Yes. That's
Design justice demands.
Let's do the
That designers.
stop. Interrogators.
well, that's we.
And then the knowledge.
We design the technology and interrogate
And then
how designers
funding
systemic injustice.
And I think there is a moment in which there is a stop. The moment of self-reflection, evaluation, when you stop, really ask yourself, and that is uncomfortable. We want to, and we don't want to accomplish that.
I got red and black, Betty, because I thought of you, so we can do
Okay, so something like design injustice demands that designers interrogate their positionality and interrogate designers find consistency.
That's good.
That's maybe the cycle can be
interrogate their positionality
Make yourself uncomfortable through the interrogation of design.
She was saying she hates it as a form of evolutionary anthropology. She says in the bigger work of social justice that can appeal to, she's like, we've got to do the bigger work to get good. So if we do the small work of saying you've got to be uncomfortable, they're not going to come in because she's into coalition. So she says,
But being uncomfortable means that you're creating.
Maybe you should draw.
Like when your chair.
So you're out, you're comfortable.
Slightly, off. No, also you're going to do some you try new ideas.
So in fact, we might have
Good to make the point that they're not the ones that we are pretty personally that's the point. I think we were even if the rest is
All right.
Yes, but she was, she was oh, maybe she's
The micro is actually
she came back. Okay. Alright, technically we have 2 more minutes.
There's like
should be
it's more like 2 power.
Because it's good, you've got to do the work.
Reveal the tension between
So I think the joyful, you think that's what we're saying? That's the but you have, yeah. All right, it's 2. I guess while we wait for the other groups to come back, you can finish up very quickly. You're ready?
Yeah, we're happy.
Good.
Good job.
So when the says go off, now I need a little bell to bring people down. Y'all ready?
she was more of a conversation. She was writing about
Y'all ready? Yes.
stateless people of
Y'all ready? I can see that. And where did the other group go? Call them back.
but it's also
If I call them back, I'm taking you all away from your work. Okay, you don't want to call them. You're not really. Okay, y'all are getting into this. This is good. All right, in these last few seconds, maybe some brownie points if you use glitter.
In order to have some terminologies, I have to have some. But that's it. Like we start with the bottom. It's like revealing something. That's
The last group is
Yeah, this is like,
Yeah, but I was
like,
sure we have
you know, delegates think so that's it. When you leave something, that's it. So you see what you're not doing, and I just thought, oh no, you did.
Proudly, it's okay.
I'll just
Alright, the last coming back now.
I'm sorry, I have to research
Okay. Bringing people back is such hard work. Alright, so as we start to come back, I mean, maybe before you share the principles, let's start off like debriefing the activity. How was this for you? Right?
We loved it.
Hard, impossible, anyone got it?
Great to do, great.
This doesn't work at all with what we do as designers.
It's good because it's really critical. Like it makes you critical of the principle. So I think sometimes by critique of principles is that they're provided to you oftentimes, and they provide a boundary you work within. And the thing about that, which is literally saying, right, reconstruct, is a really interesting exercise to help you really be critical about the principle.
Yes, so I think, I can't find your principle. Maybe that's a good place to start. It's not in the presentation. Start off telling people what your principle. You all ready to share it? Oh no, no, I see people. Okay, we'll continue some discussion alone. All right. Yes, I mean, I do this all the time. You know, I think about my own principles, and I ask students to kind of uncover the value system that's driving them. You know, and sometimes it is a kind of thought experiment, but I'm hoping that you could see how this could go into practice. You know, it could help people ground the work that they're doing. Anyone want to just kind of download some ideas that they had in their head while doing the activity? Any challenge with the activity? Yes?
I know you asked us to start with the we,
Yes.
and that was exactly the first bit we wanted to question, because the we itself is already creating an assumption that we are already something, so we spent a bit of time talking about that.
That's interesting. That's a good challenge, yes. There was a group I was talking to, and then when I think it was your, and then when I said it was your design team, then I think that made it a little clearer, you know. But that is a good point, you know. Who is the we? Very oftentimes when people talk about we, I don't consider myself part of the we. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a struggle that I have all the time. You know, when they say we, I'm like, well, okay, I'm not white, I'm not American, I'm not this, I'm not that. So how am I part of this we, right? But sometimes there is a we that we don't always see. You know, it could be, you know, sometimes, like, you know, when we do the positionality exercises, we start to see some really strange connections that we couldn't see before, you know, or like my friend there who's Brazilian said, oh, you studied in Curitiba, you know, so automatically we now have a we that didn't possibly exist before, you know. So yeah, positionality helps talking about that, but that's a really good point. Anyone else wants to? Yeah.
Yeah, we had equity, and I think what was interesting is we read the card or the prompt that we're looking at, and certainly I did, and I think the conversation in the group, we were looking for things in that little kind of proposition that helped us structure our response. And in the equity card, it mentioned two keywords we thought, which was fairness and justice. And in that stimulated an interesting conversation about the subjectivity or the objectivity about one or the other, because you could relate justice to a national framework, a decision-making scenario which was about governance, whereas fairness was more perhaps about subjectivity and therefore much more interpretation there.
Yes.
And so we had a little kind of conversation about that. We didn't conclude anything, but we were looking for ways in which we could use the prompt to kind of structure our response in terms of what flexibility or what options there might be.
Yes. And you could have rejected the prompt completely, which is the way I know one of the groups is going, right? Because you could look and say, like if I had given you inclusion, for example, I reject inclusion, right? You know, so no one can get me to put inclusion into any design principle. And I mean, maybe I would say why. You know, so like if you read the prompt, the prompt isn't to force you to go into a direction. It's really to force you to have a conversation, right? And then you can decide what is the reaction that you're going to have to that, right? All right. So I think everyone. Yes. Yeah.
That's so interesting because we had design justice, and it added the word fairness. Okay, and so we had a discussion about whether equity or equality was the word one might bring in as the third pillar. We went for equity. So actually the weird thing is that we sought to kind of connect the dots, and actually they're quite similar to the ones that you were given.
Yeah, so
either we're too well schooled.
So interestingly, we kind of led on from that and introduced appropriateness, which kind of came from Nigel Cross, this sort of sense of, you know, design ways of knowing. And again, that kind of acts as an interesting kind of fulcrum for the sense of, I guess, not justice, equity and fairness, justice and fairness. I was meaning it's almost like a pendulum, but that kind of sense of appropriateness, and therefore, you know, what one chooses to value, you know, deliberate, whatever it might be. And it took us back to maybe what we may or may not agree are design principles.
But before we share the principles, I mean, I'm a little disappointed that all of them didn't get in. So I'll share some of the ones that remained in the pack, and I guess I could have maybe organized the pack a little bit better. So abolition as a design principle, you know, it is something that I've been so I do sometimes an embarrassing amount of work with police, right? I don't always talk about it, but you know, I find myself having to think, okay, of, you know, what is a radical design principle that we could bring to these conversations. And I keep thinking, okay, if we had, you know, we talk about abolish police and defund police, you know, so if this is the design principle, what are the conversations that we're supposed to be having, right? Community is another one that didn't get out there. You know, like if we are saying that all of the work that we're going to do as designers is going to foster community, you know, what does that design principle look like? Critical theory is a card. This might have been hard to think about, but maybe it would be a design principle about just being critical, you know. I'm just going to read the ones that are not out there. So flourishing, as maybe opposed to the resilient, you know, flourishing could be a principle to consider. Indigeneity was another one. Power sharing, restoration, and social change. So all of these were the principles that if we had a bigger room, maybe some of these would have gotten out, right? But I am very curious to hear what did your team come up with for our manifesto. So we'll go around the room, we'll hear what each team says. It'll be like a little second grade kind of presentation. You show us your poster, because I don't think we really have a place. Maybe afterwards we can lay them all out. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, well you could. Yes. Well, we're going to start with your group. So, yes, tell us about, I'm going to just leave the slides up. Yeah, but, yeah. But you have to talk, you have to tell us.
Shall I talk?
Yes.
We have we also have the thing about we, but we just decided to put it in quotes and move on. And then we did the same thing with design. So we design to dis/re-articulate, and then we have some concepts related to interdependence, some of which are positive and some of which are more problematic. So we have care, the familial, solidarity, independence, community, mutuality, and then on the sort of more problematic side we have embeddedness, flattening, enforced violence, hierarchies, asymmetries, and abstractions. So we design to dis and re-articulate those concepts related to interdependence.
Right. No, I mean, I want to think, I don't know if anyone wants to ask them more about this, but that's very, well, I hate to use the word interesting, but yes, very thought-provoking. Yes. You know. But again, by using the verb, I mean, even if the collective is problematic, you know, it gives us some action to consider in the work that we're doing, right? Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Our group got justice. This is what it looks like. Design justice demands that we designers interrogate our positionality and question design's own profound complicity in systemic injustice, one brief at a time.
One brief at a time. Okay. Wow. Yes. All right. They're doing this today.
Starting now.
Okay. Which group is next? I think because I don't think there's another group there. No. So yes. Yes. Teal and.
So we had emancipation. And we similarly had some issues with the first three words for quite a while. But we've resulted in, as designers, we give up our inherited privilege in order to open up and foster self-liberation. And there's a number of words in there which we still question, but that's what we came up with. And we decided that we are breaking strong boundaries, which is the design proposal. It's trying to get out of the box.
All right. And the liberation group is upset with you.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay.
But a good segue.
So we had the word liberation. We struggled a bit because if you want to use it on its own, you can, but then it's always the proposition from. And we struggled to define that. But we came up with, you might have to help, but we work towards a design practice that is liberated from design cliches, restricting constructs, racism, heroism, capitalism, all the isms basically, progress, and empathy.
All right. Okay, yes.
And empathy is kind of thinking, because empathy can create a hierarchy of who can empathize with and who can help with.
Yeah.
So justice is maybe better than empathy.
Yeah, empathy is complicated, you know, like the problem, well, I mean, everyone will talk about empathy. All of us, I'm sure, talk about empathy all the time. I think the problem is how we talk about empathy in design, rather than the problem being empathy itself. You know, I think that we kind of, we over talk about empathy in a very superficial way. And so the way we talk about it as designers, yes, this is a little problematic. Anyway, that's not the topic of today. Let's move on to the the next one. Thank you both.
So our card was self-awareness.
Always try to put a mirror against our thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and biases, and cultivate self-awareness as we design.
All right, thank you. That's our little. Okay, I think we could go with. Yes. Okay. Yes.
We have
Equity.
equity. I could say a little bit about our elements, because we started by disarticulating. I think one of our starting points was when you gave the example of your principle of sharing power. What I thought was really interesting is that you invoked the principle as something that you had on your wall as a kind of a reminder, as something that you sort of actively brought to mind as part of your work, which I think is especially important when you have a theme like equity, because there's such a risk of like projecting in some kind of abstract space, like, oh, this is what equity means. But then it becomes almost like a distancing from the here and now. So taking that kind of inspiration from that active reminding, we started with listening practice as being key to equity. So a kind of a curiosity about the experiences and the needs and the constraints that come together in a situation, to not assume what is the relevant binary that you are addressing when you're working towards equity. So listening and curiosity, broken world thinking. So to sort of actively counter this kind of tabula rasa of modernity, where we just project some ideal into an empty space, but we are designing in and from and for broken world, and this kind of repair, orientation towards repair, appropriateness to context, so kind of that equity, an orientation to equity is also actually very situational, contextual orientation towards a situated here and now, even though Miko brought in the futuring as what is really the goal of design, to design for an equitable future. So you have that kind of tension. And I think then we heard we have to almost go. And then Robert magically produced a principle out of this conversation.
So this is on our shared office wall where we all reside. It's a guide. We will design through listening to establish the appropriate conditions needed to create an equitable world through agency in a broken world.
Okay.
From the stuff that we discussed.
Right, good, thank you. Resilience?
We had resilience, and we started kind of, I guess, with our own questioning of resilience and kind of what it means and the problems that we see with it, in the sense that it's often spoken about in the sense of building resilience within communities and maybe not. So we were thinking about the second part of both. As opposed to, so rather than building resilience, that sort of recognising people have, or communities have resilience, and more sort of thinking about how resisting rather than trying to do it. So it kind of came back to, we were sort of thinking being almost an anti-resilience, but didn't quite go there, and kind of going with that we design beyond resilience to shore up thriving futures.
Yes, the thriving futures. Yes, okay, yeah, you ended up almost in the flourishing.
Was
yes.
Yes. That came up.
Yeah, and you know that one. So resilience is in the first alphabet, and resilience came up as a theme when I was working with my colleague in Puerto Rico. And it's something that we do challenge, like, okay, so we actually do know that we are resilient, but do we want to be resilient all the time? No, so I'm glad that you challenged that. Yes.
A bit of something about also when it comes to resilience, it's this idea of at what point do we care about someone's resilience? So do we only care when they're depleted and they've got nothing, or actually when they're thriving, how do we again continue to think about the continuance of that, the resilience around their thriving and their growth, as opposed to when they're at the end of the tether. So when it comes to communities, I think it's a good time in resilience as well.
Yes, I'm looking to see, I think I have the second alphabet here, and thriving is a word in the second alphabet. Yeah. All right, thank you. If anyone wants to look through, thrive is a word in the other alphabet. Okay, we have two more? One more? Yeah, two more.
We have freedom. Bit embarrassed to show the poster after that. And we got, what is designing freedom? First point, considering the plurality of knowledges. Originally I wrote just considering plurality, but I was like, the is actually pretty important there, so it's recognizing that the plurality exists rather than maybe we should consider that it might exist. So basically, there's lots of different understandings of that term. Recognizing it is an emerging and unfolding term. There's no, for us, there's no such thing as freedom exists. It's it's kind of moving forward and getting shaped and reshaped. Freedom is a negotiation. It is relational and contingent. I became very aware of that when I had the pen and I started doing the actual poster. When I was like, I have the freedom here to decide what freedom means. Whereas there were so many good ideas going about, and I was like, oh, shit, which ones am I going to write down? So there's lots of, it's more of a negotiation rather than a set term, and it's always in relation to something. Well, for us it was. Through positionality and power asymmetries, these negotiations are understood and cared for. So recognizing your own positionality within freedom and what kind of power disparities exist within that negotiation, and then this blank space represents all the time we could fill in debating what freedom means.
All right, thank you. Okay, yes.
We had self-determination, which is a bit of a tricky one. And I should say that the four of us, as luck would have it, none of us have an extensive background in design, actually, although we're all interested in it. But we have engineering, psychology, law, and economics. So we were kind of thinking about this from a few different points of view. The definition itself talks about self-determination at the level of a country and at the level of an individual. And self-determination is believing you can control your own destiny. And we kind of talked about how there's a certain amount of delusion involved in that, of believing you can control your own destiny.
Oh my gosh.
But also, because you don't actually control your own destiny. But if you believe that you don't have any control, then you probably won't, do anything. So it's about there is a kind of tension there, and we talked about how design might be a way of revealing and moving past some of those tensions. So,
yeah. So our principle is we use design to reveal the tension between possibilities and limits of self-determination, so that we can act and respond to the actions of others. So that was our.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I want to. We'll capture images of all of these posters. If people will give me their posters to go home, that would be wonderful. But if at least we have the images, that would be great, right? So people ask me all the time, somebody asked me downstairs if I was going to use the critical alphabet here today, right? And people ask me all the time what to do with the critical alphabet and stuff like that. And it's, you know, a lot of the work that I do is about getting people to ask questions, right? And so, you know, like the alphabet really was just a reflection tool that I was using with students, and each definition in the alphabet has a question at the end of it. And it's sometimes not a question that can be answerable, it's just, you know, if we're working from this critical perspective, it is just about getting people to ask questions. So like the idea with these principles is that actually, yes, we can create some space to ask questions that might not be answerable, but at least they deepen the practice, you know, our design practice as we move forward. So maybe some of you will adopt these principles, and maybe you won't, but hopefully, you know, today, during these 19 minutes, at least we were able to create some space for you to think about questions that you don't normally get to think about in your day-to-day. So that's the end of the workshop.